breathe. Oh, thank you very much for remembering to record. Alan, then I'll read the quote and invite the bell 3 times, and we can just sit together and breathe. And then Adriana will introduce Brenda. Okay, so Brook says, I was taught that humans are inherently in a relationship with the earth. Indigenous peoples worldwide have been careful and educated stewards of the environment. We understand rocks, plants, animals, and rivers as having agency and experiencing desires and suffering. Our creation stories tell of how they once had voices. As tribes, we integrate the lessons from these stories into our value system, which governs our way of life and creates harmony. The mindset and values of the Yurok tribe have allowed us to survive and thrive for the last 12,000 years. Everyone on the planet needs to apply this wisdom for us all to thrive in the modern age.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you, everyone. Again, as we were talking about, this is the last of the series of environmental justice Indigenous-led, and the curator of this series is Brenda Perez. We are so grateful with the great work she has done. And I'm going to read a little bit about Brenda. And Brenda Perez is a local DC award-winning community activist who is passionate about fighting for the liberation of Mother Earth and oppressed people of color. Originally from Nezahualcóyotl, Mexico City, she has been living in DC since 2006. Though she began to notice disparities early on as she navigated the public education system, her formal introduction to organizing spaces happened under the training of Movement Matters, where she met other students who were organizing to address issues that were affecting them. In high school, she began to organize around language justice and the broader immigrant rights movement. She continues to organize and is currently working on the New Deal for Youth at the Center for Law and Social Policy to propose policy changes that provide more economic opportunities for youth. She has a master's degree of water resources management from the University of the District of Columbia and is a program analyst for DOEE's Office of Urban Agriculture, where her efforts focus on finding new ways to make public funds more accessible to urban farmers, to reduce food insecurity and create more opportunities to grow food locally. Recognizing that climate change is a time-sensitive issue, she strives to be inclusive and open up spaces for action in communities that have been impacted disproportionately. And thank you so much, Brenda. Your work has been impeccable. We are so glad that you have brought to us such an amazing speakers, and I leave the floor for you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Adriana and Annie. I'm so happy to be here once again with everybody. This is the third and last presentation of this series, and I'm just so glad that, you know, if you have attended and if you have seen the presentations before, I'm just really glad that you have made this journey with us. I think it's really important as, you know, we start to see more and more conversations around climate and climate change and how to tackle it. And as everybody is focusing on that, it's also a great opportunity to, you know, take a step back and reflect and ask ourselves, are we learning, you know, from the experts, from the stewards of the land that have been doing this for thousands of years, and how can we uplift their voices and their issues and the work that they're doing? And the best way to do that is to hear from the experts themselves. And I'm just really glad that every single speaker agreed to give this presentation, because I couldn't think of like, you know, like better speakers to bring to you for this series. So I'm just really happy that we have them in our community now, that they're sharing these resources, that we have these recordings, and that you're learning from them, and you know that you're taking a bunch of lessons into your everyday life and into the work that you're doing or into the community that you're part of. So yeah, just really happy, really grateful. Again, like Annie and Adriana said, this is a space for learning, you know, so you know, like make sure that, you know, you're open to that. There may be some things that may be difficult or hard to understand, but, you know, like this is why we'll have the Q&A after. And for some reason, if, you know, Brooke can't answer your questions, we'll definitely, you know, put a pin on that, and then we'll follow up later. And of course, this should be a continuous conversation. So definitely feel free to reach out to Annie and Adriana if you have any further questions or if you need any further resources. So I'm really excited to introduce you today to Brook Thompson. Brook and I met in the community. And the one thing that really, you know, like was a very like bonding opportunity was the fact that we were both studying civil engineering at the time when we met, because now we have taken, you know, like other steps into our professional careers. So we bonded over women in STEM, you know, and specifically being women of color and Native women in these spaces. I think it's so important to bring out that knowledge, especially into very technical spaces like these. Because one of the things that I've come to realize is that we have, you know, the stories of the elders, the technology that they left with us, and the knowledge. And, you know, like sometimes it looks like science is like trying to catch up to that. So there have been many, many instances where I'm like, you know, you just published a paper on this and it became like a big thing. But, you know, Native women and elders have been saying this for many, many years. So it's really incredible to have Brook in this space, and I will read their bio and then we can begin. So Brook, she's a Yurok Native American from Northern California and a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz in environmental studies. This year, she received a master's from Stanford University in environmental engineering with a focus on water resources and hydrology. In 2020, she graduated from Portland State University's Honors College with a degree in civil engineering and a minor in political science. Currently, Brook works as a restoration engineer for the Yurok tribe. She's been an intern for City of Portland Bureau of Environmental Services, the U.S. Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, the West U.S. Associates Engineering, and the California Water Resources Control Board, and Save Salmon, California. Brook is a Gates Millennium Scholar, Unity 2020-25 under 25 recipient, and a 2017 undergraduate AIGC Student of the Year awardee, among other honors. Also, Brook is mega accomplished, and you know, when I grow up, I want to be like her. Brook's goal is to bring together water rights and Native American knowledge through engineering, public policy, and social action. And current fights include undamming the Klamath River, the Missing and Murder Indigenous Women Awareness, supporting traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, and encouraging women and natives in STEM fields. And she gives public speeches and makes really, really beautiful artwork to raise awareness on these issues. So also follow her on Instagram or follow the website that she put together that is also linked to her Instagram that has all of these amazing things that she's doing in the community and all of the beautiful things that she's also creating through her artwork. So I'm gonna stop talking now and I'm gonna pass the mic to Brooke so that she can begin her presentation.
All right, thank you for that beautiful introduction, Brenda. The slide issue right now. Is someone able to share my slides while I'm talking? Okay, let's test that out.
I can do it, or Annie, perfect, okay.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we can, that's perfect. You can go to the next 2 slides. Okay, great. And everyone's able to hear me all right?
Yes,
Yes.
perfect.
Okay. Go back 1 slide. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I want to start out by talking kind of how I got into environmental justice and my background in the field. So these are some photos of me growing up. I grew up on the Yurok reservation, which is at the mouth of the Klamath River in Northern California. My life growing up revolved around salmon fishing, and so do many other tribal people's lives in the area. So you can see me with my cute little salmon art on the right-hand side. I was always an artist like that. And then me and my family, my dad specifically catching salmon with my cousins. And this is how I'd spend most of my time growing up as a kid, was on the riverbanks, fishing for salmon. And then we'd come home to my grandpa's house in the afternoons. And he was the last native speaker of my language, Yurok, where I would spend time with him. Next slide. I was also fortunate enough to grow up with my traditions and culture. So kind of how colonization worked for my tribe, we didn't have first contact officially until 1851 because of the gold rush. And even though our culture had to go underground for many years until the late 70s, we still were able to keep a lot of those cultural ties. And when I was young in the 90s, we really started bringing back our dances, which were illegal up till then. So I had the privilege to grow up with my language in my household with my grandfather, and also grow up with my culture with our healing ceremonies. So one thing about my tribe is we don't really have social dances. All our dances are around healing either people or the earth. And there's a lot of knowledge and spirituality that goes into each of these ceremonies that we do several times over the summer, and I've had the privilege to do throughout my life. Next slide. So a turning point for me was when I was 7 years old. It was the morning after one of the ceremonies, which you saw on the last page. And I got done with the ceremony with my parents. We were in a tent camping, and we heard people talking about the river and like talking about fish dying and that we need to get to the river right now. And so I remember kind of like in this misty morning or this foggy morning on the Klamath River, which I kind of tried to do a little photo collage here. I walked out of the tent with my mother, and holding her hand, we walked along the shore, and what we saw completely changed the rest of my life. Next slide. There were thousands and thousands of dead salmon lining the shorelines, salmon that were alive the day before. And for me, this was really traumatic, not only because salmon, it's revolved around my whole life and how I spend my summer, And it's even how I paid for my school clothes from a young age. I got my fishing license at 12, actually. And I paid for all my own school clothes and school supplies growing up by salmon fishing and working all summer. But for me, this was a death of a connection to my ancestors, because my tribe's been living on this area for about 15,000 years. That means my ancestors have been cultural stewards of the salmon. They have been specifically managing the salmon, so me and my grandkids would have a source of food to eat and be able to live healthy lives. And that was taken away from me in a single day. Legislation in the area in Oregon during an election year led to this 2002 fish kill on the Klamath River, which is the largest salmon kill on the west coast of the US in history. And we've never really recovered from this. I mean, even kids now who didn't grow up with this tragedy still get paranoid each year that something similar will happen. To have all these cultural ties to my ancestor dead, and this generation of fish whose ancestors grew up with my ancestors and knew them, it's really hard to express how saddening this was for me. And as someone who, when we catch a fish, we say a prayer for each fish, because at the end of the day, my tribe are prayer people. So we hold like our thoughts very sacred. And every time I catch a salmon, I pray for that fish and kind of talk to it. But when you have 30,000 dead salmon in front of you, how do you pray for every one of those fish? And how can you tell them what happened to them was right? You can't. And it was really hard, right? It's for a 7-year-old to understand all the social, political issues of the time. But I still was able to understand that someone made a decision when it came to policy who didn't grow up with these salmon around greed. And I'm the one who paid for it. And these salmon are the one who paid for it, and the river. Next slide. Since this date, the salmon population continued to decline on my river. This was my fishing dock that me and my dad built by hand in 2014 on the left. And then this is a picture of it on the right in 2021. It's no longer usable. I don't even think it's there this year at all. I think it got completely destroyed. But the salmon fishing has been so bad that when my life used to revolve around this tradition, now it's not available in my life pretty much at all. And even when it is, it's very scarce. And it's like, there might be 1 or 2 good days of fishing. And then if you miss it, it's gone. And with that, we lose not only our food source, and with that, a lot of health issues come, but we lose the ability to pass down stories, because I got a lot of stories and I got a lot of time with family when we were on the boats and we were out here fishing. But when we can't make any income from that, then we have to have jobs. And there's not a lot of jobs on the reservation, so that takes us away from the home. And so that means less time with family is spent. And all these other little cultural things that I was taught get diminished over time. Next slide. And you can see that here today, these are more recent photos where there's dead salmon fry every springtime that you can see in the water before they even get a chance to go out to the ocean. There's blue-green algae, which are caution signs around the river because of the dams cause increased blue-green algae that's toxic for us to touch. And so I grew up swimming in the river and being around it, but now you're supposed to let your kids or dogs even touch the water because it can make them sick. And if they do, they have to wash off. So really, my cousins who are younger than me now will not get the experience that I did growing up and that my family did for thousands of years previously. Next slide. Here's just some statistics about the salmon fishing too. So this was a study done in 2005. So keep that in mind, because the salmon population has gone down since then. So I think the numbers are even more disparaging now. But traditionally, people in the Brook tribe, one of my tribes, would eat 450 pounds of salmon per person per year. That's a lot of salmon. And today, we just eat about 5 pounds of salmon per person per year today being when the study was done in 2005. So it's even less than that. And my uncle has a really beautiful quote about this too, because one, it's not like we can just buy salmon in a grocery store. One, because I'm really picky about salmon now and I'm a salmon connoisseur. So like a lot of grocery store salmon tastes pretty gross to me, honestly. It's nothing like fresh salmon, but two, it's not only about catching the salmon and eating it. My uncle says, and this is a lesson from his grandmother that he got, that the best tasting salmon is the one that you give away. Meaning that in my tribe, we give salmon to those who are disabled and our elders and those who aren't able to fish first. And seeing them enjoy a fresh salmon and being able to have that connection to health, their ancestors, and all the good things that salmon brings and the good energy that we put into it when we catch it and pray for the salmon and bring it to them is a feeling of fullness, not in the stomach, but in the soul that can't be replaced. Next slide. And because of this, I started going to protests from a young age. When I was, I think in high school, I got on a bus and went all the way down to Sacramento from the reservation, which was really far for me. It's several hours away on this bus to protest at the Senate building, asking for emergency flows to be released so we wouldn't have another salmon kill. And this, after I've done that, it's kind of continued because for me as like a high schooler who was alone, I mean, I ended up not being alone because my family ended up being down there too, but having like government agents come with guns, it was the first time like I came face to face with like people with really big, scary guns that were pointed towards me just because I wanted my salmon not to die. And that's all we were asking for. We even asked, I remember this year we asked for a permit to protest and we weren't given the permit. And then, you know, the leaders of who organized this kind of said, screw it, we're gonna do it anyway. Because for us, the salmon fishing is a life or death situation. There's a prophecy that if the salmon go away, we as Indigenous people go away too. Hey, I talk about this issue a lot, but it's still like very hard for me to talk about because it's an issue that I have to like fight with every single day. But I went to that protest and got to see the change that really happened, got to see waters be released. And then I just kept doing it. Anytime there's a chance to talk about my experience and support these flows being released for the salmon, I was there. And then I kind of had this epiphany where I was able to leave the reservation, go to college and meet other Indigenous folks and really learn about the disparities for Indigenous people around the world, where I started making the connections about my river and other people's struggles. Next slide. So that made me realize that if I want to save my river, I have to support other people's rivers and water sources too. Because, right, all these water sources are connected. It's not like the water stops at a borderline and is like, oh, there's different policy here, let me act differently. No, the water is not going to care about the borderlines or the differences in policy in each state. It's all connected, and the salmon, for example, go out to the ocean each year, and some of them go into different rivers along the West Coast. And so to be a good steward to my river, I have to be a good steward to other people's rivers and waterways and land as well. And that eventually brought me to catching a ride to Standing Rock, and which was wild for me because I was also when I was, I think, 19, and I got a ride with people I didn't know all the way to Standing Rock, and I got left there actually. They ended up not being great people, but I got to be there and meet all these other natives where it was just like almost like a mini native city from different tribes talking about their water issues, and it really opened up my perspective. And I was there to fight for their water up there in the Dakotas, because I'm hoping one day other Indigenous people would come and help fight for me in our rivers in California and so on. And And when I was at Standing Rock, it had me questioning myself. So, right, we have this thing we want. We're asking all these people for this water, for this protection, and it's not out of selfish reasons. It's out of a necessity to survive and for us to live better lives instead of pretty much giving greed to these corporations who would make more profit, which, a lot of the people wouldn't even see in the area. I'd say almost no one would really see in the area. But I was wondering, like, who's hearing these demands? What's happening after they hear what we want? And how does the decision-making process happen so we get what we're asking for or we don't get what we're asking for? And it kind of felt like I was yelling out into the void at these protests and rallies. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but I wanted a better understanding on why it did or didn't work. And because of that, I applied for a scholarship to go to DC. So next slide. So I got a scholarship to go to the Native American Political Leadership Program in Washington, D.C. for a term. I studied at George Washington University and eventually got my political science minor. And this was really special to me because this was a world that none of my family was open to before. I mean, college was new for my Native family. I'm the first person with a 4-year degree, and definitely first person with a master's with my Native side, but the policy sides, like, I didn't know any politicians really at the time. And so working in the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and seeing how policy went by, what people are looking for, what changes people's mind on what they pay attention to, what they don't pay attention to, what they sign, and pretty much how the legislation process works in the United States really gave me a more in-depth understanding, which we don't have time to go into, on what I needed to do to get my voice across. And I'm very privileged because I honestly applied to this fellowship not thinking I was going to get it, because why would they send a civil engineer to DC to study politics? And this is where I got to meet the lovely Brenda as well, which I'm very grateful for. Next slide. Yeah, so after being in DC as well, I still went to protests and rallies and talked to people who I learned at Standing Rock in these different areas. But I also continued my engineering degree and started to go to these city council meetings and to talk to legislators using words that I learned in DC and kind of learning what they want to hear and expressing that, and or like formatting my story in a way that was acceptable to politicians. And that made me be able to meet with a lot more politicians who actually listened to me. And it was strange because for me, like, one, they really liked the engineering side, and having the technical knowledge of engineering was really beneficial when talking about water issues, because I could say not only are these, for example, pipelines are bad for our culture and tribal nations, but I could also say they're bad infrastructure problems for this, and this reason. And so it's hard, but it's hard for me to like express this because what I was asking for didn't change, but how I said it, and those in power who saw me, their perspectives of me changed because I was going to college, because I'm an educated Native, and because I spent time in DC, which to me doesn't feel right because a lot of my cousins don't have the same opportunities. If you round the amount of Native American women in civil engineering to the nearest 2 digits, it's still 0. It's just so frustrating to me that we don't have these opportunities to be in these spaces. And yet I'm listened to because I did all this work to get all these degrees and go all these places. And because of that, I had to leave my homeland too, right? So I try to go back to my home as much as I can, but I also have to recognize I'm more disconnected than some people who are on the reservation because there's no schools right on the reservation for me. I have to leave home to get these degrees, and then I'm not on the reservation. And a lot of people don't return to the reservation afterwards because you get all these fancy job offers in the city where you don't have to drive 2 hours each way or more sometimes. Sometimes it's like a full day to get food. Or you don't have to stay in trailers, or it's poor housing. And it's insane to me that I can be in this space and that there are times I'm listened to, like those who are here right now are listening to me, but there's so many who are on the reservation who aren't. But yet we're saying the same things and our wants are the same. And maybe some of them could say it better than I can, but they just don't have the chance. Next slide. The next big change for me was the Fish and Game Commission on the spring Chinook decision. So this is where environmental justice really sticks in my mind, and the reason I went on to my PhD. So the Fish and Game Commission in California had this decision they were going to make if spring and fall Chinook salmon were different species. And this is important because at that moment they weren't considered separate species, they were considered the same, just slightly genetically diverse, but that the spring salmon could re-evolve from the fall salmon. But new genetic research came out recently that showed that they are genetically distinct enough where you can't have the spring salmon again once they go away or once they become extinct. And this decision first came about through a petition that was put in 2018. And I heard about this, and again, with like my background knowledge in the politics now, and I was working for Save California Salmon and my indigenous background, I know that the spring and fall Chinook salmon have different words in Yurok and Karuk in our languages, which is really important because there's other species of fish and animals that we kind of just are different species, but we group together with one word, but we make a really distinct point to separate them. And everyone knows in the tribes that fish that spring and fall salmon have different tastes and they have different behaviors because we've been fishing for them all our lives and all our ancestors' lives as well. So I helped with many other people and rally a bunch of indigenous folks to come to this meeting and speak on this issue. And many of them said the same thing about their experiences with the spring and fall salmon and their indigenous knowledge about it. And fortunately, the Fish and Game Commission did decide to support having the spring and fall salmon as distinct species, which is a really big win and great for the salmon and the water. But when they were making their decision on this, they specifically said when they were wrapping up that they cannot make decisions based on traditional ecological knowledge because that's not one of their like bullet points of tasks they can approve decisions on. And this made me really disappointed, especially when the traditional ecological knowledge backs up what is being told with the genetics and something we've already known. It's just the science is catching up to it. But I'm glad it passed. And I do think all the indigenous people speaking did make a difference, even if they aren't officially allowed to make a decision based on it. But that just showed me there's many holes where policy could be supported by indigenous knowledge in California. Well, pretty much everywhere, but I have to have so much scope for my PhD, right? But that policy can be supported by tech and traditional knowledge. But we need to find these holes of where they are and make recommendations on how it can be supported. And the other important part of this too is that Erica, who is one of the people on the commission, she was recently elected, and I know her through academia because she also works on salmon issues. And she's a woman of color, and she, right before this board was all white. And so having her be like the only woman of color, person of color on this board was, and having that connection to me through academia was important because she let me know people weren't showing up to the commission hearing, to the hearings. And so I was able to get people to come because she wanted to know more about the issue. And I do think that made a significant change on how this outcome went. But right, if she as a person of color was on that board, then I wouldn't have known. And then I wouldn't have been able to bring my friends and colleagues and also those at Stanford who also could speak on the technical background to this meeting. And so just one more thing, why the diversity matters, because otherwise, who knows what may have happened with this decision. And a lot of these boards and commissions are majority white. Next slide. So that led me to my PhD that I'm just starting my first week on. I'm getting through orientation week this week. And so I'm a bit all over the place because of that too. But for me, I wanted to study the integration. I will study the integration of indigenous knowledge into California water policy. to establish practical climate change policy, we need Indigenous input. And so because of this issue that happened last year with the spring salmon decision, it pushed me into this PhD, because I can go into this workforce as a civil engineer, and actually having a PhD as a civil engineer is a bit detrimental. And I could be making way more money initially, but for me, this is an important issue that I really want to look into, because one, if you've ever worked in politics, and especially state politics, you might know that the state boards and pretty much political agencies in general don't talk to each other very well. So this gives me a chance to look at the system from a holistic view, where if these organizations themselves are doing the work, they'd have a very limited scope on what they're doing. And it also gives me a chance to do this work without these different departments and tribal liaisons getting the funding to do the work. And so my hope is I can point out all these holes or areas where Indigenous knowledge can be input into these systems of making policy decisions. And then the tribal liaisons for these different organizations can point to my research as an academic and say, this is what has been tested, and this is what can be done to improve our agency's relationship with tribes and tribal input. And then hopefully, my hope is that it will pass faster, because I really want to do work and research that's going to lead to real change and outcome, and not just be theoretical forever. Next slide. So who is climate change for? So now I'm kind of getting away from my personal story and getting into the ideas of Indigenous people and climate justice as a whole. Environmental justice is a social movement seeking to achieve the fair and equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens associated with economic production. So this is done through protection of laws, regulations, and policies. And there is no environmental justice without racial justice. And there's no environmental justice without considering how race, national origin, income, ability impacts opportunity and treatment when it comes to the enforcement with regards to environmental justice. Next slide. So one of the things I really tried to press is traditional ecological knowledge, which is pretty much what we were talking about when we were talking about the spring salmon decision. That was tech. And tech is, I won't bother reading this paragraph, but you can if you want, but it's pretty much the evolving knowledge base of Indigenous people passed down from thousands of years of having a close relationship with the land and water. And this includes management practices and science, which is relationships between plants, animals, phenomenons, landscapes, lifeways, etc. So kind of the hard science of it. But something I don't think is looked into as much, which I feel like should be, is values and leadership around tech. So for example, diversity of inputs. So when we saw the last slide, or go ahead and go to the last slide. Previous one. Back again, sorry. Back one more? Okay, got it. So for example, diversity of inputs. If you look at the Senate and you look at the House right now, we don't have a lot of diversity of inputs. It's mainly over-representative of old white men, right? And for Indigenous people, for a lot of tribes, when they have their councils, it was important to have a diversity of people at the table. This includes youth, elders, and those from different backgrounds, including gender and gender orientation and sexual orientation. And so having these different backgrounds creates more diversity in opinions and can come up with better solutions than if you have someone with all the same background in a room making these decisions for everyone. Next slide. We have forms of conflict resolution in the tribes. We have different perspectives on plants and animals, such as, for example, in my tribe, we have a bunch of different counting systems. So something I would count something that's like round, like the soda bottle cap, different than I'd count this flat thing. There'd be two different counting systems for those. But the counting system for salmon and people are the same. So that just kind of gives insight on how important the salmon are and how we consider them, same as redwood trees. And so for us having that counting system and having that perspective that we are not above salmon and that we're on equal playing grounds, if there's no salmon, then there's no us, helps shift the way we would make potentially legislation about these topics. We have ways we do negotiations, and our mindset's a lot longer than in policy. So in policy, we have ideas, right? It's really focused around economics and kind of what we can afford. And we tend to say that we can't make policy that's going to affect that many future generations because we don't know what they're going to want. And I find this a bit silly because we know they're going to want food, we know they're going to want water, and we know they're going to want clean air, for example. And that we should start thinking about several generations ahead of time, because even right now in the American conscious, especially around politics, it feels really difficult for people to even think about their kids or their grandkids who are making these decisions. And yet a lot of Indigenous people are thinking 7 generations down the line, many, many, many more generations. And having that wider mindset would really be beneficial to all of us, especially when it comes to this time of climate change, because these aren't going to be issues that are solved in any of our lifetimes. And for me as an engineer, you can see this with the dams, which are one of the reasons we're having the salmon issues. It's because the dams on the Klamath River, in addition to many other. But for example, when you're designing a dam can have a design life from like 50 to 100 and something years. But one thing is we don't design how to take out the dam when we're designing the dam itself. We assume that future engineers will have better technology and are smarter and that they'll figure it out themselves. And so we don't even bother. And for me, it's a bit ridiculous. Like I understand it in a sense, but as all the engineers are now trying to figure out how to take out these dams, it's not like we have crazy lasers to just disintegrate them, right? It's still a struggle for us. And if a way to take out the dam safely was designed when making the dam itself, it would have probably gone a lot smoother, but we don't have that long-term perspective. And all those engineers who would have designed the dam because of the long design life, they're either retired or dead by the time the dam's ready to be taken out. So it's not really like they have an investment in it. But yeah, so tech is hard sciences and also management styles that would be beneficial when it comes to climate change and should be brought to the table and forefront when making these decisions about our future. Next slide. So natives are vulnerable, extra vulnerable to climate change, but we're also protectors. So Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change. And this is important because there's about 370 million people who are Indigenous around the world, which is about 5% of the world's population. In nearly 2,000 communities in 87 countries, these were areas where 27 million people will be potentially affected by sea level rise, which is the effect of climate change. And there is not a part of the world where coastal Native people do not live. And I'm one of them. I'm a coastal Native person. And you can see this, some of my friends who live in the Pacifics, they've seen burial grounds they've had for centuries start to go underwater. So they can't visit their ancestors' graves anymore because they're flooding. There's deforestation. Indigenous peoples and local communities manage at least 24% of the world's forests. And biodiversity. Indigenous peoples protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. So despite being extra vulnerable to climate change and having all these disparities against us, we are doing a lot of the heavy lifting work when it comes to protecting the environment. Next slide. So if tech is all of this, doing this great things, and Indigenous people are these cool leaders that can potentially help us, why aren't we using it and why aren't we doing this right now? Next slide. I don't have time, obviously, to go through the history of all the wrong things the US has done and the systematic issues, but one of the things that was surprising to me is, and especially because I didn't learn this till college, was it really felt like environmentalism was initially created for white people. So environmentalism is at the most basic advocating for the protection of our environment. But the Sierra Club, whose founder was known as the founder of the national parks, or the father of the national park system, said horrible things. And just to make clear, the national park system and the Sierra Club was initially upper class white man's explorers club, and they're protecting the wilderness in order for them, as people who could afford to be out in the wilderness, the ability to enjoy it longer. It wasn't for other people, it was specifically for that one group. The founder described African Americans as lazy sambos, which is an offensive term. He described Native Americans as being dirty. He was preserving nature for white people. And he was good friends with a dude named Fairfield Osborne. And Fairfield worked to conserve nature as well. So that's one of the reasons they were good friends. But he also was a white supremacist. And Osborne founded the American Eugenics Society and did all these pretty much horrible things. So, and they didn't allow women or people of color in their club during the Sierras Club. And so a lot of people really support the national parks, and I do too, but think of it as this great thing that preserved this nature for everyone to enjoy. But that's really not how it started. And there's Theodore Roosevelt who helped with this, where he was known as a conservation president, and he doubled the number of sites of national parks in the system. However, he said the following, next slide. He said, "I don't go so far as to think the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. So, right, for me, this was devastating when I learned this, because as a kid, because of the national park system and the teddy bear and things like that, Teddy Roosevelt was my favorite president. And then I found out about this, and I felt like, oh, wait, these people I was taught to look up to in school actually hate me as a person because I'm Native American and nothing else. And just knowing that knowing that's kind of when I started to be disillusioned where I was being told in school, this was elementary school for me, about Teddy Roosevelt might have not been the truth. Led to a lot of, I don't want to say issues, but a lot of clarity later in life. Next slide. And of course, this is an issue. Like, my tribe does cultural burns. And so that's one of the reasons we have these intense wildfires here in California, is because my tribe used to do burns each year, and many other tribes here as well. And we created prairies because of this. And we had insects and wildlife evolve alongside us instead of in spite of us, where there's this idea that wilderness is pristine, untouched. However, most of this wilderness, quote unquote, pristine landscape in the United States was being closely managed and taken care of by indigenous folk. And just because some groups, such as like the Europeaners who came, were destructive to it and caused harm, doesn't mean everyone who was human was causing the same amount of harm. And so we had a different relationship, and we really were working in one-on-one with the environment, not despite of it. And so when we weren't burning the brush, these large wildfires came up, because then there was these piles of brush from years and years, and it let these huge wildfires roam, which were much more destructive. And we're only now starting to get back into this burning practice after hundreds of years of these horrible wildfires are now becoming even more intense because of climate change. And then we have these prairies that are going away, that a lot of bug species are becoming endangered because of this. Because, I want to say, like, white folks are the people in charge. We're thinking that these were natural occurring prairies, and yet we were the ones who created the prairies and were maintaining them over thousands of years. And without us, they start to disappear. Next slide. And Native people were removed from many more times after this. So a lot of kind of the hesitation when it comes to Indigenous knowledge now comes from this past idea of removing natives. So natives were removed because we were thought we weren't using the land appropriately, right? We weren't farming it, and therefore we weren't taking advantage of it. President Andrew Jackson described natives as children in need of guidance, and said that the removal policy was beneficial to us. A government report in Southern California explained that many Californians believed that destiny had awarded California to the Americans to develop, and that if the Indians interfered with progress, they should be pushed aside. And this is in 1852. And remember, my tribe's first contact is in 1851 in California. And this mindset of justifying the removal of Native Americans and that we're childlike and that we're just kind of stupid has led to us not being taken seriously today when it comes to these topics of climate change and just kind of STEM in general. We're seen as less worthy because we don't know what we're talking about. And this comes from a lot of implicit bias, maybe people not really understanding why they think this or why they have those preconceptions. But it's coming from this passed down history of justification for removal of Native Americans from the land. And then you see this today, well, hopefully not as much today, but at least previously with natives in media when they have Tonto speak. And you may know Tonto speak. I have pictures from Peter Pan down on the bottom, which are really bad caricatures, but the kind of like broken language, like me, Brook, you, da da da, buffalo, da da da, like, you know, really broken up language that is kind of misspoken. And this actually comes from alienating natives. And so when it sounds like it's someone's coming from a different country, not being able to speak English, right? And so when natives are portrayed speaking like this, it others them. And there's actually a Harvard study about implicit bias where it shows the majority of Americans see Native Americans as foreign and as white people as native. And when I took that test personally, like let that sink in, like most Americans implicitly think of Native Americans as foreign to the United States. That is partially because of how media has portrayed us as speaking this broken English and, you know, not being here in present day. So we've continued to be hurt by these media portrayals and how we're shown, and the fact that there's not a very good representation of us in media now to change that narrative. And we have things like reservation dogs, but like having 1 or 2 TV shows is not enough to change the mainstream narrative of how natives are seen. Next slide. And this is all to say that it is not enough just to put more BIPOC in these positions of leadership. The current systems are based in systems of oppression. We need to be open to change and move forward by looking back to what has worked previously for us, such as the models that have worked for Indigenous people. And we've already have done that in some cases, like the format, there's different formats of the US government, including the separation of the 3 powers and legislative branches of government that's based on the Iroquois Confederacy, which is an agreement between multiple tribes on the East Coast. And so there have been multiple times where we have pulled from Indigenous knowledge and it has been successful. But because it's not talked about in the mainstream or acknowledged very often, you know, it's not seen as Indigenous knowledge. We give credit to the white folks, like always, and it continues to hurt us in having power when having these conversations of why we should be listened to. Diversity opens up possibilities that were not previously at the table, especially when it comes to climate change. And so this, again, is to bring up that we need multiple people at the table. So we not only need Indigenous people, we need Black folk, we need people with different sexual orientations and gender identities. We need people with different abilities. I couldn't get into this right now, but there's a lot of overlap between disability justice and justice for people of color and how those laws are intertwined. And so I recommend that if you have time after this, to kind of look into that. And if you want some recommendations, I can give those too, or I'll put them on my website. And like another example is I don't see a lot of kids at the table. Like when talking to some government agencies that are expressing concerns about climate change, I see sometimes kids put at the table when they're being like, oh, that's cute, like keep doing what you're doing and someday you'll be like an old white man who can make the decisions, instead of taking their considerations as being important right now. Because, for example, a lot of children don't have the same, they weren't they haven't gone through the system yet. They don't have the same kind of caps that are put on their imagination that have been put on us after years of being, kind of pushed down by the system. And so having kids at the table give a lot of good ideas and energy, and it's really going to be their future. So they really should have input on what's going on when it comes to climate change in their futures. But yeah, we kind of do the same thing where we just consider them dumb because they're young and right, they don't have their college degrees yet. So how could they have a real opinion? And so for me, when we bring Indigenous knowledge to the table, is bringing all these others backgrounds to the table as well, because that's a part of Indigenous knowledge and therefore climate and environmental justice. Next slide. So to end, I want to end with these two quotes from other activists that I think are doing a really good job in the field. This first one is from Ms. Rivera, where she says, "We as Indigenous women and Indigenous people believe it is vital to take into account our knowledge to prevent and adapt to climate change, because the communities are the ones who know how." And so I learned about her through the UN, and that's kind of one of the spaces that I'm really hoping to push to change, is more presence of Indigenous people in the UN. And it's honestly, it's as someone who, I know there's a lot of people who, especially in DC, who have a lot of insight in the UN, but for me, as someone who's a part of a tribal nation, not being invited to the table as the same power and just not having like delegates each year from like the different tribes who are seen as nations within inside the United States invited to the table as equal partners with these other nations is kind of honestly disrespectful to me. It really does make me feel like we're playing pretend nations and they don't see us as a real entity, where I feel like in the United States or United Nations, we should be invited to the table more as Indigenous nations and have more of our youth come to speak at these meetings. Next slide. The next is from Eloy. "The Indigenous culture teaches us to respect rivers, lakes, plants, animals, and spiritual beings who live in these places. You can't solve the climate crisis without including Indigenous peoples and without protecting their territories." And again, this leads me back to the slide where I talked about the biodiversity and forests are protected by Indigenous people. We're already doing the work. So we just need, if we're given the power and the authority to do more of what we've already been doing, we could come to these solutions a lot quicker. But again, yet we're often seen, where if we're seen at all, I guess that's one of the other issues, is as Indigenous people, we're often not seen. I've met multiple people in colleges that didn't know that Native Americans were still alive at all. Nonetheless, that we're doing all this important work when it comes to climate change and climate justice. But that we're just kind of seen as a secondary entity in that, let the grown-ups play, the people who've been in politics forever and the people who screwed up the world initially, let them figure it out instead of bringing in these new actors, or rather these old actors like these Indigenous groups, to hear our voice and opinion and take it seriously. And for me, I guess you can go to the last slide or next slide. I just want to say that for me, being born Native American is being born inherently political, because so much of our lives as Indigenous people is wrapped up in politics in the United States. I cannot just live in my tribe and live a life that my ancestors did. I can't go fishing and hunting and have my traditions without my other cousins and family members going off the reservation, getting beat up by federal agents, and literally fighting just for our ability to keep practicing the ways we have. I have to spend much of the time off my reservation, going to these universities, learning these other forms of policy and law in order to help protect the way my people are living. And again, it's hard because how am I going to be a good advocate if I'm not there experiencing and learning it firsthand all the time? And so we're really at a disadvantage here because of that. And I wish my life didn't have to be inherently political, but it is. And I really enjoy what I'm doing right now, and I'm really fortunate for all I have. But again, there's just so much more to do. And I'm so thankful that those of you who are here have taken the time out of your day to listen to me a little bit. So thank you, Wakla.
Wow, thank you so much, Brooke. Really appreciate your presentation. And it also made me really sad. A lot of the times we think that, the land, the rivers have been deteriorated for many years now, like in Mexico, like our rivers were like covered in cement in like 1521, and that was such a long time ago. I wasn't even there yet. And, like to hear that this is something that happened within your lifetime, it's very eye-opening to me. It's like, it's still happening. These decisions are still being made today. And I also really appreciate how you put, like, who are the experts and like, who should we be listening to and who should be at the decision-making table. When I started organizing when I was 15 years old, because I was like, like some things got to change in the DC public school system. And there was one politician who looked at me and said, like, I have a master's degree in education, I'm here in this position, like, how can you tell me what to do and how the policy should change for an education, And I looked at him and I was like, I sit on that desk every single day. I talk to my teachers every single day. And all of the students that were behind me, who were like 15 of them, I was like, they do as well. How can you tell us that we don't know what needs to change when we sit in those desks every single day? We go through the curriculum and nothing changed, but it was really powerful to say that and for us to change the narrative of like, who are the experts? And when it comes to Indigenous communities, Indigenous communities have been, working on these sciences for thousands of years. And it is science that is so carefully curated, that took people looking at nature and studying nature very carefully for thousands of years, that was vetted by the community. And so to say now, like, you don't know what you're talking about, it's kind of ridiculous to me. I'm like, how can you possibly waste thousands of years of science, especially in critical moments like that, like this, like the ones that we're living in right now? So I really love this term, TEK, traditional environmental knowledge. Is that what it is? Did I get it right? Okay, cool.
Yeah, environmental or ecological, either is fine.
Oh, environmental or ecological. Yeah, so I really love this term. And I guess my first question before I open it to the rest of the group is, where did this term come from? Is this something that you came up with? Who has been using it? And I see how you're using it in your work, and like also like now or later, if you can share like any resources where it's been used, like that would be wonderful. But yeah, I just wanted a little bit of more background into that.
Oh yeah, actually that's a super good question. I don't know when the word TEK started to be used, or kind of like who coined the term, but it's really popular in like my field of work, or in Indigenous academia. And so it's just to, again, talk about the field of knowledge that Indigenous people have through that thousands of years of connection with the environment. And I kind of see it as, when you're doing the scientific method, right? If you're in Western science and you're doing a study, you have maybe 1 or 2 years observing phenomenon with phenomenon on a certain subject. The Indigenous people have thousands of years of data points from observed knowledge passed down on specific events or issues or ways of management. And so just because it's not written down doesn't mean it's not as valid, because our stories were through oral tradition. And so yeah, I'll have to Google that, because I've never considered that. It's a good question where it started to be used. It's a pretty popular term. I mean, Government organizations will use that too. Like the quote I had on my slide was from the Fish and Wildlife Commission, or Fish. It's from one of the like large federal organizations. So yeah, it's a pretty well used term. I think there's another term like it. There's like TREK. There's a yeah. Yeah, so look that.
Yeah.
Up. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for like letting us know that this is something that is being used in Native academia, which is like this is why we need to be in collaboration and talk to other groups of people, because you guys are basically this like coming up with these terms and these ways of thinking, and I'm like, this is the kind of thing that needs to be uplifted and invested in, so that we can also apply it to come up with solutions to the climate change problems that we see today. So like I'm glad that I get to dig into this term. And before I add more comments and questions, I wanted to open it up to anybody else. Does anybody have questions, comments for Brooke?
I can just add something to what Brooke said, because I have the quote. I used it yesterday in my Instagram. So what it said is tech is traditional ecological knowledge, also called by other names, included indigenous knowledge or native science. Here, therefore, tech refers to the evolving knowledge acquired by indigenous and local people over hundreds of thousands of years through direct contact with the environment. The agency who use it, and you have it in your website, is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And if no one has I have like a comment, or I want to ask you, because for me, and this is the point of making visible, is the invisibility of this knowledge or these communities. And it was shocking for me coming from Mexico, and Brenda will understand this, because in Mexico, at the end, we really know our indigenous people. The society is not fair sometimes, but we know about our tradition, we know about indigenous groups. But here in the United States, it's been shocking to me to even learn that people, even living here in DC, they don't know, for example, about the Piscataway people. So it's crazy that noticing that in this country. And for me, it was shocking, and I don't know how to answer that to people. For example, when I told them that we have our first series about indigenous, that the Piscataway people are one of the groups that are here in this area, and they are here. And the question that they asked me after telling that was like so shocking. Like they told me, where can we go and see them? It was like, what? And really? No, like if there's something like completely separate, I was telling. So the lack of respect, the lack of visibility. So what else can we do, or what can we do to share more about the knowledge, the respect, the culture, and to be able to civilize these important communities? Hi,
yeah. So one thing I'm doing is I'm developing a book list that I'm going to be posting on my website and on my Instagram that will have a variety of history told about the Americas from Native American viewpoints. So if it's one of the things that's hard is because we have so much history and so much diversity between these groups of indigenous people. And so to ask everyone to learn that when there isn't really a basis for it, I'll be realistic, it is difficult. But I'd say like the first thing to do is look up whose land you are on currently. Look up the city you're in and look up the tribes that used to reside there. And sometimes there's land trust you can donate to and find out more about, where you can donate money so indigenous groups in the area can help buy back land or help create stewardship in the area. But yeah, the first step is always finding out whose land you're currently on. Like I'm on traditional Ohlone land here in Santa Cruz. and seeing about their histories, if they're still around, if there's a way you can contribute locally. Because a lot of these solutions, and when it comes to even policy change, a lot of the solutions come initially from local politics and local change. And then second would be just to educate yourself about general current Native American, I'd say, disparities, or maybe not even disparities, but artists. Like, celebrate the good things too. Like, there's a lot of current day Native American artists that are doing amazing work that should be supported. And a lot of their artwork is going to tell about their history and their lives as well. And so you can learn through that. And there will be powwows that are in the area that you can go and visit. There will be, I mean, every state has at least one powwow, but every large city usually has a powwow too, which is like which is a traditional gathering of different nations that come and dance and pray. And so those are a good place to kind of get more well acquainted, and you'll find out local resources of tribes that are there who are fundraising or raising awareness of different issues too. I would also say, probably just Googling common misconceptions. Maybe I'll put something on my page too, my website, about this, but it's just like, one of the things that's really distressing for me daily is like getting asked really like kind of rude questions. Like, a lot of people have the misconception that like we don't pay taxes, and I pay so many taxes. There's just like all these small things that I get told daily because I'm Native that aren't true, but it's kind of like in the public conscious, and it's just not really, people don't really think about it that critically because of it. But yeah, the reading books from Native American perspectives, consuming media that is not about Natives, but written by and created by Natives. And you can also subscribe to news articles like Native News Today and Indian Country Today. And High Country News are all really good places to hear from Indigenous voices and keep up on Indigenous issues. And so staying current with what's happening in the area, I think, is really important. I guess that's my biggest thing, is like understanding the disparities in the past, but also really understanding we're current day people who have struggles and also are having accomplishments right here and right now. Because a lot of what we've been taught in schools, at least here in the US, if anything, was who we were hundreds of years ago, and not who we are and what we're facing because of those past disparities today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then also, talking about artists and, consuming media from Native folk, that was one of the things that our previous speakers, Ashton and Tomas, said. And Tomas, is somebody that has been exploring, like, how do I distribute this information in my way so that it relates to more people. So follow them on Instagram. I'll put their link, and continue to learn from them. They're amazing. And another thing, yes, let's also celebrate the great things that are happening, which is one of the things that have also come up in their previous series of celebrating Indigenous identity and coming into the movement from a point of joy, because it is joyous and there are many things that should be celebrated. And joy, especially for people of color, for Black, Indigenous people of color, is an act of resistance. So celebrating with us and uplifting that is really important work as well. And then oh, you muted by accident.
No, I was just pointing out that Laura,
they have their hand up, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add to that. First of all, thanking everybody, Annie and Adriana, for making visible, and Brenda and Brooke for just this incredible information given with such clear perspective, but great heart. And just to say to all the people of European heritage that are on this call, that one of the things that we have to do is not just consume this knowledge, but we need to understand that, race is a concept that was created in the 1600s in order to divide people, in order to create economic opportunity for older white men, basically. And in order to do that, it had to create fear, and it had to create a division between a false division between living things, and then the amnesia or the frosting that was put on that continues today. So if as people of European heritage, if we want to do something about this, we can't just consume it. We have to talk it. We have to acknowledge it. It has to be in our everyday conversation, not like that 1960s in your face militant thing, but just like, and oh, by the way, this is true. Or, oh, by the way, I'm wondering, what do the Native people think about that? Or just observing, just making the observations of what you know to be true, including them in your factual conversation as a given, to help start to put some medicine on that blindness that's been imposed for centuries on our culture. Thank you.
To add what Laura's saying, if you're white and you are fortunate enough to have a job, looking at your workplace and asking, are there certain people who aren't at the table here? Why aren't there more BIPOC at positions of power at my job? Why is there no Native Americans here? And if we do hire a Native American or a person of color, how do I stick up for them? Are we using inappropriate language like the word powwow in the workplace, bottom of the totem pole, etc., in the workplace, Indian giver, etc.? How can I make it more comfortable for them? And ask yourself, like, is it okay to ask certain questions? Is this something I can Google first? And when they speak up about something wrong, how can you be there to support them? So not only just mentioning us in conversations, but this can be applied to any situation, like anywhere you work, anywhere you volunteer. Think about who's missing there and how we can be more incorporated.
And if I might add to that too, just a little wordsmithing. In the Sangha I participate in, we are now using the term global majority instead of BIPOC. There's nothing wrong with the term BIPOC, but global majority is true because there are more people of color than not. So I really like to use that term global majority.
Cool. Thank you for that comment, question, and thank you, Brooke. So there is one more question in the chat, and we'll do two more questions, the question from the chat and one more from if anybody else has another question. So one question from Mackenzie is, thank you so much, or comment question, thank you so much for sharing and being here. My question is, what areas of law do you see as the most important for furthering environmental justice? I just started law school and have been trying to figure out what direction to take my career and focus, and I was just wondering what areas, actions you see as the most impactful.
Oh man, I feel like this can actually get like really complicated talking this question. One, congrats on being in law school. Two, I think just getting a sense of where your question is coming from and hearing that you're trying to figure out law school. I will say that I know a lot of people who go into environmental law, and same with environmental engineering, that you go into environmental law and engineering with these hopes that you're going to be fighting these good fights and making these huge differences, which many do, but a lot of times you also end up getting hired by these like oil corporations and these like firms that are the polluters to kind of do a greenwashing type of thing where you're doing law or doing engineering work to make things the least environmentally harmful while still working for corporations whose interest is still in the kind of harmful category. And so just to be careful about that, because those will be the jobs that end up paying or that you will have consistently. Which is why I didn't initially go into environmental engineering as a going into school. But the other thing is, I would say like for me personally, it's been like, oh gosh, again, you could probably go into any system of law and find places for it to change and work on that. Could give a whole lecture just on this. I'm trying to figure out how to shorten what I want to say. I mean, like for example, like my tribe has given our river personhood. So my tribe has recognized our river, like such as corporations have in the large US, as having personhood. So that opens us up to sue and on behalf of the river in the future. And so a lot of progress is made, as you probably know, being in law school, is through these lawsuits on specific issues. So I'd say as long as you're doing work you enjoy and that you're not going to get exhausted in 10 years, that's probably the most important part. And there will be tribes and indigenous people that have lawsuits that are in a bunch of different fields are ultimately going to benefit the environment. I say do what you're passionate about. Just be careful about like going into environmental law specifically. Civil court, there will be opportunities, even if it's not every single day, but just keeping in mind that everyone who is in law school really should have a good grasp on Indian law, because it's very different and a lot of law schools don't go as much in depth into it. And you'll see, like, if you're in DC, if you can go to some Supreme Court hearings when they have them in person on Native American issues or when tribes are suing, because a lot of our issues go to federal court. And there's a lot of Supreme Court justices who don't have a very good idea on Indian law. And because of that, and even in the Senate, if you work as a staffer, if all your time is taken up explaining basics of Native American law instead of the actual issue that you're trying to represent, it's already putting us at a disadvantage. And so I'd say almost making sure your colleagues in your law school is taking Native American law seriously is just as important as what you end up studying in the long term, and how you can change the structure of your school and your system, even if it's a little bit while you're in that system. No pressure, but like it will be a lot of work regardless, because you're in law school. So you might as well do a little more work to try to get your other classmates to study this stuff too. Okay, so we can go to the last question if you want.
Nice.
Is that Wendy?
Yeah, so really life-changing questions over here. But yes, Wendy, what is your question?
So first of all, I am on Narragansett Wampanoag land. However, I've recently taken that down because I feel like I need to do something in terms of reparations, and so I don't feel like I have the right to even say that I'm on that land until I'm doing something that's ethical. And I'm wondering, and congratulations on getting into your PhD program, because wow, I mean, I just think you are a mover and a shaker, and it's like you are an awesome, coming from an awesome perspective, and oh my gosh, and I'm wondering, you mentioned that in your tribe, or that you have a way of reaching like not a consensus, but healing situations among yourselves, one another, working out conflict resolution. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because that's we in this tradition that we sit in our Sangha, we have something called beginning anew that we do. And I'm just wondering if there's a similarity or something.
Well, I guess with the time we have left, I'll just give you one more piece of knowledge that I have personally growing up around that topic. So after that, I had to start charging. No. So like, right, I grew up with my language, and we have this thing called speaking in like your native mindset, or like your Yurok brain, and then your English brain, because how those of you who are bilingual will understand that like thinking in different languages will change your perspective on something because of words you may or may not have in one language or other, or how the meaning changes. And for example, in Yurok, there is not a direct translation for the word sorry. So in my culture, you can't just say sorry and then be like, oh, okay, everything's fine, right? We actually had like old school type, what equivalent of like a lawyer would be in my tribe, where if you had a dispute or a confrontation, that there would be a third party, which would act kind of how a lawyer does now, to see what wrongs were done and what they would have memorized different payments and different remediations. And so say like something happened, like say I accidentally tripped you on the street when we're walking by or something, and I'd be like, oh no, maybe you hurt yourself and now you can't fish, or now you can't hunt. So instead of saying sorry and then just going on my way, maybe I give you food and help you provide for yourself, because now you're not able to do that because of me. And I want to show you that I do feel bad about that action and I want to help you. Or I would give you equivalent in like money, like I would pay you so much money, kind of like, again, what we do in current law, where I'd be like, I feel bad about this. Here is this amount of money we both agree on. And in exchange, we're going to let these feelings go. And so we're not expected to say this word sorry and have everything magically be better. And I think that's very true, even in Western culture, even if it's not acknowledged, or if you say a word, it doesn't mean as much as if you do an action to show that you're truly sorry. And then also the feelings of letting it go, like you'll see even after lawsuits that people will get the money and not be happy about it. But letting those feelings go and then getting on with your life, but also like both parties acknowledging that there is wrong being done and then coming to agreement on how to heal that wrongdoing. So that's something like I try to take in my daily life, for example, or kind of like the intention I just put into everything every day. Like I think one of the other really common things that I do that's from my native mindset is how we refer to things. Like I wouldn't say like this is a card. I would say like this is being a card. And so I think of it as having like a being, like all my language is verb, so it's being this thing. And that kind of changes your mindset on how you think of objects around you. And anything we make in my tribe has a spirit put into it, and you want that to be a good spirit. So we're always like thinking about things around us as not as much objects, but as beings that also require respect, especially when it comes to like plants, rocks, and animals. And when you're walking down the street, I see like people like pluck leaves and twigs or like kick random things. And if you think of those as having their own like personhood or being, you treat it a lot differently. You're not suddenly just like kicking a plant for no reason just because you're bored. You're being more considerate. It's just like those small things really change my daily life and how I live, but aren't necessarily apparent and come from the language. Is that what you're looking for? I don't know.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Yeah. It gives me some understanding. Of course, I mean, I'm not native, so I am not going to completely understand ever, but that gives me more understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And just to be clear, like I'm still learning myself too. Like I like English was unfortunately my first language. So I'm kind of like tainted by it. And you can see that with like how sometimes I try to have conversations in New York and we're like, say something, we're like, oh wait, we don't have the words to say this because we wouldn't say this.
Yeah.
And it's just like it's also hard for me to step out of like being raised in Western culture. It's not like I'm some all-knowing being that was raised perfectly in my tribe. I'm still trying to decolonize and learn every day with everyone else too. But yeah, thank you guys so much for letting me be here. It's such a privilege.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, amazing. Thank you.
It was an absolutely eye-opening, as always, that we are here in this space. And we thank you so much, because we always need to be acknowledged that we need to learn every day, that we don't have the knowledge, and hear from the communities, and hear from the people who really are part of this community, and understand, no, what our next movements needs to be in accordance to what you are telling us. Annie?
Yeah, no, I just 100%. I love how we're looking at the technology of environment. And I love that phrase, the tech is so great, because so often there's this like, oh, indigenous ways are all just spiritual, but no, this is concrete and, you know, technical and science-based. So wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
we want to thank Brenda for all the series, the curation. It was absolutely amazing. The people you brought, the concept, and the way you did all the work so thoroughly, so professional, so such an amazing way, and all the speakers. And something to point out is that all of our speakers were young people,
Mhm.
who have so much knowledge already to show, to teach us, and you are all people of color, and that's important for us always to be aware and to listen to other cultures, other people, other points of view. So thank you so much, Brenda, because you brought all that to this space, and we are so thankful for that. And Brooke, it was amazing. And about environmental justice, our previous series was about environmental, sorry, sorry, I put it in the chat. You were mentioning justice.
Disability justice.
Disability justice.
Oh,
Sorry.
yes.
I forgot in English. Disability justice. So we have all that there, and we are so grateful for all of you to be here and be willing to learn with us. Brenda, Annie, what else?
I think that's it. Thank you to Don for captioning as always. And
it's his birthday. He's working.
oh, and it's his birthday. Yes.
Helping
Happy
us
birthday,
in
Don.
his birthday day. So thank you so much. And
And thank you
Rachel,
to Rachel. Yep, Rachel does a lot of our communications, or all of our communications and marketing. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you to all of you. I mean, really, without you, there wouldn't be anything to do. You wouldn't be there, so then we wouldn't be able to offer these. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who contributes financially. That helps us a lot too. So yeah, really appreciate it. We don't have our next series lined up yet, but we're working on it. And we have 2 series we're kind of thinking and working on. So, but be looking out for us very soon.
very
next
soon.
one.
Yeah, thank you. And meanwhile, you can please share our website and follow in making